afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're delighted to have you here at St. Cross. Thank you very much for turning out on a very, very cold Friday evening. But at least it's not raining, on the bright side. This is the first of an annual series of lectures that we're planning at St. Cross. This is our inauguration lecture. We're absolutely delighted to have Walter here to speak to us tonight. As you probably know, that the St. Cross College has a very long association with the Uehiro Foundation in Japan, and as a result of which we have quite a lot of people within the college who specialise in practical ethics, which is why we wanted to make the theme of our first series around practical ethics, which is a very broad topic and can always bring in things that are very relevant and topical to today, as we have with AI today. So what I wanted to just mention was that we have some wonderful scholars in our audience today, all funded by the Uehiro Foundation. There was a major foundation, a major gift to the University of Oxford, which you may have heard about this year, for the endowment of the Uehiro Institute. I'm delighted to have Roger Christopher today, who is head of that institute. But it also has endowed scholarships for students who are based here at St. Cross. So welcome all of those new scholars here tonight. So I'm going to hand over now to Alberto Giulini, who is a fellow of St. Cross College, but also a research fellow at the Uehiro Institute, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight. Walter, we're delighted to have you all the way from North Carolina, which is probably a little bit warmer than here. And despite a horrible 12-hour delay to your flight, we're very pleased you made it here, and you're very welcome. Alberto.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Welcome, everyone. So before I introduce Walter, I have to remind you that this is a public lecture, and it will be filmed and recorded, with the idea of putting it online afterwards. So there is a camera that will only be filming Walter, but some people might end up in the filming. So if you do not wish to be filmed, please let Milos know. Milos is the person like that, and we can carry it out at the end. So please let him know if you have any problem with that. Having said so, I can proceed with introducing Walter. So for the philosophers in the room, I suppose Walter doesn't need introduction. And if I had to introduce him properly, the introduction will be longer than probably. So I will say just very briefly that Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong is the Chauncey Stillman Professor of Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. Walter is, of course, an eminent philosopher whose area of expertise span an impressive array of fields. So his research covers moral artificial intelligence, political polarization, consciousness, free will, and various topics in moral psychology, neuroscience. Although I would say he's perhaps best known, maybe what are you best known for? I would say for the work on moral skepticism. But
for having no discount.
Yeah, exactly. We should say something about that. Well, this wide range of expertise means that he has many appointments in many places in the world, including at the Uehiro Oxford Institute, where Walter is a distinguished research fellow. He teaches a very popular online course called Think Again, and I think there was a book coming out of the course called Think Again, How to Reason and Argue. Other books include Clean Hands, Philosophical Lessons on Scrupulosity, Morality Without God, and Moral Skepticism, that I mentioned earlier. So this evening, Walter will be talking about his latest book, his Moral AI and How We Get There, co-author with Jana Shedford and Vincent Kreutzer. But about his lack of discipline. So what he's going to do is, so the format is going to speak for, say, 10 or 15 minutes, something like that, and then he's going to take questions, and then he's going to speak again and take questions, which is good for me because it makes the chairing very easy, so I don't have to do anything, so you will handle the question. Is it right? Okay, with some discipline. Good. So, yeah, also I remind you there is a wine reception after the lecture, so you're most welcome to stay, stick around for that, and to have a chat with Walter or any of us. So, without further ado, I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Thank you for having me. I've always been a big fan of St. Cross College, I must say. I mean, really, I came here, many years ago, and I got offers from a bunch of colleges, but this was the one that did not have high table, and I thought that was great. I remember going for lunch one time with Roger, and Roger also sat down with the hoi polloi. And so I've loved and had some wonderful conversations and pool games and drinks and so on here. So it's a great honor to just be in this series, and I hope I'll do it justice. I also want to thank the Uehiro Foundation, who over the years has just been extremely generous. I mean, one of the best ethics centers in the world, I would even say the best ethics center in the world, gets helped by them. And it could not have turned into what it's turned into without their help. And so now for it to be an institute is even better. But tonight I've got to pick one topic to talk about. So I figured I'd talk about our new book because it just came out. Alberta already mentioned it. There's Jana, there's Vince. But all of these people are on the team. It spans from undergrads to postdocs to faculty members and people out in business and so on. And we've been funded by a number of different groups, the Future of Life Institute, Templeton, World Charity, Duke, and OpenAI. So I want to start by thanking all of them because otherwise I might forget. I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is first is just tell you a little bit informally about the book, see if you have any questions about that. Then I'm going to focus on one particular chapter, if this works. Oops. There we go. This is our book, Moral AI and How We Get There. Came out with Penguin this year. Get it at Amazon. And the goal of the book is to teach people a little bit about AI and the ethical issues that arise, but then eventually get around to the issue of what are we going to do about it? Because a lot of people have talked about what the problems are. Not that many people have solutions. So what is AI simply talks about the nature of AI and what we mean by it. We don't mean anything fancy. We're counting just plain old machine learning used to predict things and reinforcement learning to achieve tasks. It doesn't have to be kind of obscure or opaque or deep AI. We have a very broad definition. Can it be safe? In that chapter, we focus on medicine and military weapons and uses of AI, where people get hurt and killed when AI makes mistakes. And some of the things that lead to those mistakes, one emphasis that we have in that chapter is that the mistakes aren't always the fault of the technology. It's just humans kind of misinterpret and aren't used to it and react. And maybe they'll get better, but you want them to get better quicker. And so you need training programs to make sure that people are going to use the AI in safe ways. Can AI respect privacy? We look largely at the internet. In your phone, if you say, well, I want to know what the weather is, so I'm going to let it track where I am and tell me where the weather is. Well, wait a second. Now, it's able to locate you. Well, that's no big deal. I don't care whether people know where I am or not. That doesn't make any difference. But wait a minute. 20 years later, it might, right? Because you might have a different partner. Oh, you were at so-and-so's apartment. And that's all on the internet, and you can't get rid of it. So there's some real problems there. One of the things that we emphasize is the ability to erase it, and get rid of it. Because you might not mind now, and you might mind a lot more later. A lot of young people we find don't really care about privacy anymore because they think, you can't do anything about it, it's gone. So we try to convince them that it actually is some very important issues there. Can AI be fair? There we focus on the use of AI in the legal system, and in particular the use of Compass for determining bail in the U.S. Compass is a program that many jurisdictions in the U.S. use to see who gets bail and who doesn't get bail. And it really affects people's lives because If you don't get bail, you might be waiting in jail for 6 months. You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your apartment. You might lose your family. And then you're found innocent, not guilty. Too bad. You've still lost your job and your apartment and your family. And so if it makes mistakes, those are very serious mistakes. There we actually argue that, what do you think, judges don't make mistakes? Judges make mistakes too. The relevant question is not whether AI makes mistakes. It will. The relevant question is whether AI makes fewer or more mistakes and of worse kinds than judges do. And so we kind of say that's what we really need to focus on. And can AI or its creators or users be responsible? There we focus on self-driving cars, and we look in detail at an accident in Arizona. And the question is, is the driver, well, she wasn't even the driver because she was just sitting in the driver's seat while the car drove. Or maybe it's the pedestrian whom she hit because that person crossed without any reflectors in the middle of the night where there was not a crosswalk at that point, although there was one only 100 yards up. Or maybe it was the Uber company for putting this self-driving car out on the road too early. Or maybe it was the state for allowing Uber to do that because they had to pass a special law to make that possible. And so there are a lot of different people who might be held responsible, but when there's so many people that could be held responsible, the danger is that nobody will be held responsible. And if nobody is held responsible, then there's no incentive to make it better. That's the problem, often called the responsibility gap. So that's chapter 5. And then there's chapter 6 and 7. That's where we say, so what are we going to do about it? Sit around and complain? Yell and scream and say, isn't this horrible? Our society is going to pot. No, we want to do something about it. So in chapter 6, we describe how to build human morality into an artificial intelligence system so that it doesn't violate the rules. Not in technical detail, but in general terms. And then in chapter 7, the really basic problem is, how do you get the businesses to do this? I mean, they're making billions. How do you get them to actually obey the rules? And so we've got 5 pillars of how you can get businesses to actually pay attention to these rules. I don't know how realistic they are, but they're our hope, our dream. And we think that they might at least solve some of the problem. So that's just a quick summary of the book. I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk about chapter 6, how to build morality into AI. But before I get there, I want to see whether there are any questions about the other chapters. I do this every once in a while because I can't possibly concentrate for a full hour. And so I want to make sure that somebody's got a question. Yeah?
I've actually got a question about whether AI can be fair and replacing judges, because one of the things that's really bothering me about that is that if you just have today's data, that's probably fine, but as humans we evolve and our perception of what is legally acceptable and what isn't legally acceptable also evolves. So it's not that long ago that homosexuality was a criminal offence, right? And I'm just concerned that if we just leave it to AI to determine whether something is right or wrong in that respect, it will never decide that actually things have changed and homosexuality is now not a criminal offence anymore.
Yeah, I'm concerned too. That's something you definitely want to avoid. Now, do you think the judge will be any better at that? The judge is also using what they know from the past, right? The AI can pick up on the recent law. As soon as Congress passes the law, bam, the AI knows it. As soon as it's published on the internet, bam, it knows it. Judges, well, what are they doing? They're using a lot of their experience. Well, what does that mean? It's not like they have a fair sample. They might have found out, there was one judge who said, I know that people with tattoos are more likely to commit crimes again. Like, what world are you living in? AI is not going to use that. Judges, I think, are harder to bring up to date than the AI is in some ways. But in terms of your point, we got to be concerned about it. We got to be careful about it. Here. I totally agree.
Yes, can I go back a bit? Which is the ideal medium of communication which avoids these problems?
There is no ideal in this world. If there were perfection, I haven't found it. I don't know where the ideal is. I just want to get better.
No, but there's no model at which your aim language is better, is it? Is television worse? If you compare it with rival styles of communication, has any of them set a model which you are aspiring to reach?
I'll show you my model in a second, but it's not going to be television, that's for sure. And it's not going to be the internet either, at least in terms of gaining information. Yeah. And last question. Yeah.
Also about chapter 4, I can think of arguments in both directions away from your conclusion that what matters is simply how we maximize the correct outcome. In favor of thinking that it's worse when a judge makes the decisions rather than the AI. One of the problems with racism and discrimination is not just the bad outcomes, the unfair outcomes, but also that you are a racist and
the intention, the character traits, yeah.
For the judge, that's literally true about them. When we say that an AI is racist, it's a bit of a figure of speech of some sort, I think. There's also arguments to the effect that when the AI makes the racist mistake, it's worse than individual judges making it. And it's that the AI is us. The AI is what, it's the structure. It's what Rawls would say, the basic structure. So Rawls would have maybe said that there is injustice in the basic structure is worse than injustice which occurs to the people who mete out what the basic structure tells us.
I'm not going to even attempt to interpret Rawls here. People will be glad to hear. But I do want to agree completely with your first point. When the AI does it, like, it's a mistake. It's not like the programmer intended it or anybody intended it. And secondly, you can detect the mistake because it's easy to monitor the AI, whereas the judge says, you're not going to see my notes, forget it. And it's easy to correct them because how do you talk a judge into doing better next time? But the AI you can reprogram so that it avoids that. We'll actually talk about one way to do it further on. But there are a number of reasons to favor the AI, and not just that it's going to do it less. But when I saw the actual figures, I was really impressed. Like, you can have 20% fewer people in jail and 20% less crime with no more discrimination, no more racial inequality, even less, I think, racial inequality, if you use AI instead of judges. Because judges, they take the 1% top most dangerous people who should not be released on bail, and 50% of them they let out. So a lot of it has to do with my pessimism about human nature, as you'll see. Okay. So we're going to focus now on building AI building human morality into AI. And it all started with this doctor at Duke. And we were already working on kidney allocations. And saw him at a conference. And he came up and he said, what you said really hits home, because the other night, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call and it said, you got to come to the hospital and perform a kidney transplant. And right now, you've got to tell us which patient to wake up and prep for surgery. And he said, well, look, I need to look at my nose. I said, no, you can't look at your nose. This person died in the automobile accident a while ago, and the kidney is getting worse every minute. You got to get here as fast as you can and wake this person up as fast as you can. You can't like take time to look at your notes. He goes, but I like some of my patients more than others, and so I'm not going to be fair to these people. Too bad. You got to tell us who to prep. Like right now, tell us who. And he said, I'm groggy. I was out last night. I didn't know this was going to happen. And obviously, this person is in a far from ideal circumstance to make a life and death decision for a kidney transplant recipient. So we said, we want to help this guy. But that's just one example of someone being in the wrong circumstances to make an appropriate moral decision. Humans do it all the time. And when I say they make a moral mistake, I don't mean, I think you're wrong, even though you think you're right. I mean, people make mistakes that they themselves recognize as mistakes by their own standards. It's kind of like speaking the English language, which I find difficult. I can't believe you guys invented it. It's like, couldn't you invent something simpler? I make mistakes all the time. You say, he are or they is, and then you think a minute later, oh my God, what did I just do? And people do it. So that's, in linguistics, that's called a performance error, because your performance doesn't match what the grammatical rules are and what you ought to say. Well, people do the same thing in morality. They make mistakes by their own lights. Why would they do that? Well, they might just not know the facts of the situation. They might think they know them and don't know them, or they might have known them but they forgot them, or they didn't really forget them, they just kind of overlooked them when they were thinking about it. People get confused because these situations are very complex. They involve a whole lot of different factors that point in different directions, and then how do you take it all into consideration? They have emotions. Nothing wrong with emotion. I want to make it clear, there's nothing wrong with emotion. But some emotions can get so strong that they mislead you. Sometimes strong emotions are totally appropriate. If someone raped my daughter, I would be mad as hell. And I think I would be justified in being mad. So there's nothing wrong with that. But if it clouds my judgment and makes me want to kill that guy, then I'm not sure we should be trusting the moral judgment at that point. And bias, of course. We have bias not just race and gender bias, but bias in favor of yourself over other people, and your family over your next door neighbors, and your family over people who live on the other side of the world as well. So all of these problems lead people to make moral mistakes by their own lights. Let's say, AI doesn't do that. It doesn't forget facts. Now, it doesn't have all the facts entered into it, but it can check all the facts. And it doesn't get confused, right? It does extremely complex things. We've got this program, and it keeps going, well, there's a 5-way interaction among these different factors. And I tried to have some statistician explain to me what a 5-way interaction is, and it's way above my head. And so I get confused by the complexity, but the AI had no trouble. And it doesn't succumb to emotion or bias. We'll talk about bias later because I know that's a controversial one. I'm going to stop in just a minute for more questions. That's why I stop at certain points. So maybe we can reduce some human moral errors by building human morality into AI. Let me emphasize, we're not having the AI create its own moral standards. We're trying to get the AI to operate by human moral standards of a certain sort, as you'll see. How are we going to do that? Well, one way to do it would be to take the true moral principles and apply them down to the case. I'm afraid that we might not all agree on what those principles are. And so we might agree on something very vague like we ought to have justice. But then you ask us what we mean by justice, and we mean totally different things, right? And so that's a problem for taking the general principles and applying it down. There are a lot of people who have tried to build moral AI that way. We don't think it works. The other way to do it is to start with very concrete cases with no restrictions on how the AI is going to interpret them. Just search the internet for articles about moral issues around the world. And we have a friend in Renee Weber at Santa Barbara does that. And you can get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cases very quickly. And then you can also get judgments about what's right or wrong, and you can use that database to predict what the person is going to say about the case. And there's a problem with that too, because if you're simply predicting what those judgments are, you're going to include a lot of things that are irrelevant. So one of my favorite examples is you want to predict what someone's going to say about a moral judgment, about a moral case. You simply look at whether they use definite articles like the or indefinite articles like and that will actually help predict not all the variants, but explain some of the variants in their moral judgment. Because men tend to use the more than women who use and. But that doesn't tell you why it's right or wrong. That doesn't give you any reason, so you don't really understand the moral judgment. You're simply able to predict it. So what we try to do is build a hybrid where we only look at the relevant features, so it's restricted, but then we do it bottom up from cases. And I'll show you how that works, but first I want to see if there are any more questions. Yeah?
Yeah, so back on the previous slide, you were saying how AI does not get confused by complexity or succumb to emotional bias.
Yeah.
What makes you say that? Like, especially
Because
if
it's
you train
true.
AI. Well, if you train AI on human examples where people do behave irrationally, emotionally, in biased ways, wouldn't they learn from those patterns?
Yes.
Or aren't there cases where the complexity is so overwhelming that it cannot handle that?
So you notice that if it's predicting the human response, then it's aware of the human confusion and the human emotion. And it's using that to predict the human response. But it itself is not getting confused. It's predicting correctly. So I want to distinguish the humans being confused from the AI being confused, and the humans being emotional from the AI being emotional. And all I'm saying is that the AI is not the one that introduces that problem. It's the humans when they enter the data. Yeah?
Yes, up there are stored facts. Question of challenging accepted wisdom.
Right.
The AI is trained on what's already out there, but that may not necessarily be correct. In the days of Galileo, the prevailing idea was the Earth was flat. In medicine, the idea that stomach ulcers might be caused by bacterial viruses.
Yeah, and the brain cools the blood.
Every child a generation ago had tonsillectomy, which is now evident. So how if at all, can you build challenge into AI systems?
So you have to look at the particular application, because the way you do it is going to be different in different applications. If you're talking about kidney allocation, as we will, then it's the facts about the patient, right? But the bottom line is, look, you can get it wrong, and if you get it wrong, you're going to get it wrong. And again, the trick is to do it less often, right? There are going to be cases where when we feed the human consensus, maybe it's possible climate change is not really due to human action. And we'll find that out in 50 years. But you use the best data you've got.
The risk is that AI suppresses that sort of challenge, and that is inherently concerned.
Absolutely, and you've got to make sure it doesn't do that. That's not part of our program, but I agree with you. You got to make sure it doesn't suppress contrary positions. Yeah.
On your argument around creating a divide between whether it's the human or the computer that introduces the idea of bias, I'm wondering how viable that kind of distinction really is. and I ship it and it's racist and it's used in a immigration proceeding, then I still have a racist computer vision algorithm that's out there functioning in the world, and I have an AI system that is biased, and yet you're saying that an AI is not succumbing to bias. I'm struggling with that distinction that you're trying to make.
So I'm going to come back to bias later. It's certainly the most controversial and perhaps the most important case. But I'm going to propose that there's a way to correct for the biases. And the basic line is going to be, predict the human moral judgments, measure the bias by looking at the patterns of results over many, many cases, and then correct for the bias so as to remove the biases that you want to get rid of. That's going to be Crystal Yang's method. I'm basically endorsing what Crystal said. But, okay, I'll do one more and then I'm moving on. Yeah.
Is it okay for there to be different systems in place in different parts of the world?
Absolutely, yes.
So a Chinese system of AI, an American system, because you're advocating an American system of AI.
So take, for example, kidney allocation. The rules in the UK might be different from the rules in North Carolina. Yeah. And I think, there are going to be some limits on that. If North Carolinians said, we're not giving any kidneys to black people, you go, no, but there are going to be reasonable disagreements. And it might be that, those reasonable disagreements are resolved differently in the UK than in North Carolina. And then the systems can try them out, see how they work, look at the performance over time, look at the social effects, and so on.
But you're presuming that there is some sort of agreed, amicable communication. But if you've got different systems that are based on morality that behave like a god and machine, then it could cause all sorts of terrible.
No, you're absolutely right. If people are shooting missiles at each other, this is not going to solve the problem. Yeah. But you do what you can. Okay. So we started with kidney because of our doctor friend, but we actually were working on kidneys before that, partly because we have AI is already used in these kidney exchanges. I mean, what happens is, say my wife needs a kidney, and I say, I'll donate a kidney, I've got two, you can have one of mine, but the doctor says, sorry, but you've got blood type A, she's got blood type O, you can't donate to her. But I've got this other pair of patients who are brother and sister, and the brother needs a kidney, he's got blood type A, so you can donate to him. But unfortunately, the sister can't donate to your wife. But there's this third couple where they're friends, and he's got the blood type of the sister, and the donor has, so now you can exchange them. Now, this has been going on in kidney allocation, kidney transplant centers for decades. And they've got chains of this, over 100 long, to make them all work. And there are a lot of practical problems, like you got to do it all at the same time, or if the husband gives to the brother, then the sister goes, I'm quitting. And she doesn't give, and then the whole chain gets broken. So there's some real practical problems, but they already use computers to figure out how to do this in an effective way. And what we're saying is, let's build some moral judgments into that about who should get the kidney or not. So the first step, I'm just going to go through our methods step by step. First step is you survey people and you say, when you got two people who need a kidney and one kidney available, which features of the patients do you think should matter? Should make a difference to who gets the kidney? Right? And they give you a list of features. Then you look at what they wrote, and a lot of it's nonsense, because you do these online and people write all kinds of things, and they use different words to refer to the same thing, and they, they misdescribe. Anyway, And they forget things like, well, what if one of them's a murderer? Oh, I didn't think of that. But if they were, that would matter to me. So you have to supplement and refine, and then you confirm in a separate study that the features on the list really do matter. So here's just one example of a very small study, but it's small enough that it's easy. You can put it on a slide. That was the advantage. And notice we had almost nobody saying that sexual orientation, race, or gender should matter. And the ones who did, it turned out they often said, well, black people have been discriminated in so many different ways, they ought to get some advantage here. And so they weren't necessarily going against the disadvantaged race. And almost everybody agreed that current physical health should matter, age should matter, history of alcohol consumption. Now this was done in the US. I went to Germany, and it turns out it would be illegal to put age there in Germany. But you can put life expectancy. As we'll see when we get to the actual surveys. And then there are going to be some that people disagree about. I mentioned record of violent crime and number of children. I mean, after all, if somebody has no children, the other person has 3 children, you're helping 4 people by giving this person a kid, and you're helping this one person by, assuming they have the same number of friends and so on, right? So there's some that are controversial. And then what you do is you construct concrete scenarios where those features conflict, where some of them favor patient A and some of them favor patient B. And then you ask lay people who should get the kidney when they conflict. So, by a show of hands, who should get it? A or B? Now, A is younger. So if you think younger people have a higher life expectancy, people with higher life expectancy should get a kidney, I might favor patient A. Drinks pre-diagnosis. Heavy consumption of alcohol is correlated with kidney disease, so they might be their own fault they have kidney disease to a certain extent. Maybe, can't be sure. And this one has 2, and B, so that might favor patient A. So the first 2 might favor patient A, for many people at least, not for everybody. But patient B, so how many people would give it to patient A? How many people give it to patient B? Oh, that was about half and half. That's good. That's what we show in the surveys. Okay, what about this one? So notice we're changing the features. How many years have you been on the wait list for a kidney? Patient A's been on 3 years, patient B's been on 5 years. Weekly work hours is after you get the kidney transplant. Are you going to be able to work full time? Are you going to be fully recovered where you can just go back to your old job and or are you going to still be a little bit debilitated? And we're talking 1 year after the transplant, when you're fully recovered from the transplant. Not everybody is fully recovered. And now instead of child dependence, we have elderly dependence. And we have obesity. This one's obese and underweight. I don't know which one of those are people supposed to favor. But life years gained, so notice years waiting might favor patient B, work hours might favor patient A, elderly dependence might favor patient B, life years gained, by the transplant. So you live 20 years longer with the transplant than without. The other person lives 10 years longer with the transplant than without. On average, obviously a prediction, can't be sure. How many people give the kidney to patient A? How many people give it to patient B? Yeah, so we're going to get some disagreement there. And so what that shows you is that we need to look at the features and why you're doing it individually to see what the weights are and how they interact. Oh, I had one more, sorry. What about this one? Patient A, 1 violent crime. Patient B, 2. Patient A, alcoholic drinks. Patient B, 4 per day. Number of child dependents is the same at 2. And patient A is going to gain 2 decades of life, and patient B is going to gain just 1. Okay? How many people would give it to patient A? How many people give it to patient B? You see, so there's some we agree on. I just want to point that out, right? It's much more fun to do the ones you disagree about, But we have found, well, I'll show you some data later, where we showed like 99% of the people agreeing on a bunch of scenarios. But the ones where you disagree, these are the interesting ones. And there, the question is, okay, why? And why are you putting weight on this rather than that? Okay? And then, so you learn a model to predict the individual's judgment. No, it's not predicting everybody else's, but just yours. You do, in some studies, as few as 20 to get a prediction, but in others, as many as 600. We've done a bunch of studies. And so, around 90% accuracy, we can predict what you're going to say in a given, if we train it on, say you do 100, train it on 70, test it on 30, we can get 90% accuracy plus. We're actually, with a little bit of fine tuning, we're up to 92.4, but there's an upper limit for a reason that we'll see in a second, okay? And then you aggregate it into groups. So if there's an ethics committee, we can predict that on this ethics committee, 8 out of the 10 people will go this way, or 9, or 7, or 6. And what do? How does that help? Well, the ethics committee, Dom can testify to this. Ethics committees, they're like in a hurry. Typically, the ones I've been on, it's like we were in a hurry. We had an hour with 6 or 8 doctors sitting there, and me taking up all the time by talking, and they had a bunch of cases to get through, and we didn't have enough time to get through them as carefully as we want. This can tell you which ones we actually need to talk about, because there's going to be real disagreement, as opposed to all 10 of you are going to end up agreeing about that one. Like, let's focus on the others. So it can be used in that way. And we can compare moral judgments by individuals and groups. So we'll be able to study those differences between the UK and North Carolina and figure out exactly why, because of this feature is the one that you're putting on, or you're having an interaction with this other one and they don't, or what exactly it is in the computations that are leading to the differences between the communities. But in my opinion, at least, the most important is the individuals, because I've been married to my wife for 47 years, and she is still a mystery. I don't understand what's going on with that woman. And so this gives me the hope that maybe I can figure out why she's saying the things she says. No, that's just a joke. But although she is a mystery, I hope she doesn't see this video. Oh, well, anyway, she knows I say this. So that's the general method, okay? Now, I want to admit limitations, okay? We need much larger, more representative samples. We're gathering, more of that. We've done that since. You'll actually see one with a bunch of people. We're gathering a new sample of almost 1,000 people. We need samples in doctors, nurses, stakeholders, people with kidney disease, family members, advocacy groups, and so on. Got to get those. But notice that this method will enable us to figure out what the differences are and then talk about them and focus on where the real differences are. So the hope is that it'll help that discussion. And of course, we need other countries. We'd love to get samples in England or the rest of Europe. I have colleagues in Brazil, China, and India. We can use Besample, which now you can do surveys in 42 different countries. So there's some new methods of doing that, but we need to do all that. That's future directions. So there we go. Yes. I saw you, Ted.
Yes, so I was wondering, you mentioned that you decide what people think based on the audience, so you have a list. And when you evaluate the list, who decides? Who is deciding about what you will keep and what you will remove from that list?
What we will put in the scenarios, you mean? Which features will live?
You make a survey, you collect a list of characteristics, and some of them would be relevant, some would be nonsense, some others would be good and useful. Like a doctor would agree that it's essential.
Yeah.
How do you decide what are the essentials that still reflect the general judgment of people?
Because you have to go back and ask them again. I think one of the biggest problems, and we'll come back to this, but one of the biggest problems in the way surveys are done now is they ask people a question and then they draw a conclusion. You ought to ask them a question and go back and say, is this what you meant? And you could ask them, is that what you meant? And they'll tell you, oh yeah. So you go, age, well, what about life expectancy? Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I favor the 20-year-old over the 80-year-old. They have a longer life expectancy. Oh, okay, so that's what you meant. And so you have to do the follow-up studies, though. It's not easy work to do, but you're absolutely right, you have to do it.
Okay, but that means that somehow the lay audience is like the expert. Because I would think that if doctors or a medical background specialist will have more weight on the decision of the factors.
Well, they do at present. And as a result, for example, they don't care how many kids you have. Because they say, look, it's the parent that's my patient, not the kids. My job's to figure, and you go, okay, well, not everybody agrees with that. And they go, I don't care whether this person committed 3 horrendous murders. You know, they don't care. That's not a medical issue. And so they're going to have certain views, and the public are going to have certain views. We're not trying to resolve that disagreement. But if we do the sample in doctors and nurses, we can figure out where the differences lie, and then we talk about why. It's part of a discussion. It's not meant to do the, yeah.
I was wondering if there's like missing data. For example, if I refuse to disclose if I drink alcohol, how do you think the AI would assess me in your example of the kidney transplant?
If you refuse to what?
Like you had a lot of different information that you'd use, like age or dependence. Or what if some of them are dependent on the patient offering information, like if you drink?
Yeah, then you might not have the information.
Yeah. So,
and then you put unknown.
But how would I be disadvantaged by the calculation if there isn't that information for me compared to someone that has?
I mean, in a case like revealing your past drink habits, typically your doctor will know, and it'll be in your health record, and this is being done by the hospital, so they'll have access to that. But if you've consistently refused to get information, we just put unknown under your name.
Yeah, like if you're a new patient, or if you're like in a new healthcare system with no record.
Yeah, then you put unknown.
With the list, or how would it sort you out?
Yeah, and then you just, under alcoholic drink, instead of saying 0 or 4, it just says unknown.
I'm just wondering about the implications of that from a moral point of view, how it would assess you compared to someone that has a lot more information on them.
Well, I mean, that's the kind of decision that doctors have to make.
Yeah.
It's not easy. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the ecological validity of this. Can you say something more? Because it seems like what you can predict is how people would respond in this very specific situation. But this is not the situation that you find in the hospital. And on the other hand, you want to predict rationally and reflectively what people would say the doctor should do. This is not what you're asking them to do in this study. So
Right.
could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, we are asking them who should get the kidney. I mean, the website is whoshouldgettthekidney.com. So we are asking them, for a moral, but it's not what the doctor would say about who should get the kidney, right? So I'm not sure what the problem is.
The problem is that if we want to know the ideal and reflective preferences, maybe this is not the way to ask it.
Good. If that's the problem, I totally agree. And that's the problem. And why not? Because of what I said at the start. Because people are going to be ignorant and biased and confused. So why should you care about what they say? That's not going to tell you what they ought to say even. You know, they don't even tell you what their moral rules are because they can make performance mistakes and so on. Yeah?
Just a question, but if you argue that human morality is basically flawed in itself because we're all ignorant, biased, and inconsistent, is it then even possible to build human morality into any other external system? Because then there wouldn't be such a thing as human morality, because it would just be like a weird wave of...
So I'll show you how.
Okay.
Good question. Thurgood Marshall to the rescue. How many people know who Thurgood Marshall is? Yeah, so Thurgood Marshall was a Supreme Court justice. Before that, actually argued the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in the US that ended school segregation and other forms of segregation eventually. In the early 70s, 72 in Furman versus Georgia, there was a capital punishment case, and the relevant legal standard at that point was contemporary standards of decency. Not the only standard, but that was one of the standards that the justices had to rule on. And so the people in favor of capital punishment said, look, most states in the Union have capital punishment, so it must meet contemporary standards of decency. And Thurgood Marshall said, no, because they could be making a performance error, like saying they is, right? If they were better informed, they would consider it shocking, unjust, and unacceptable, he said in 1972. And of course, the people on the other side laughed at that and made fun of it, but actually his side won the case nonetheless. And it came back up again in a later case, Gregg versus Georgia, 4 years later. But in the meantime, Austin Serrett and Neil Vidmar being a Duke law professor, did a study showing that, in fact, what Thurgood Marshall said was called the Marshall hypothesis, was true. And the way they did it was they correlated how much you knew about capital punishment with what your views were. And then to get a causal claim, they manipulated by giving you information. And I'm talking information that had been cleared by both sides as, yes, this is accurate. This is what really happens, right? It wasn't like skewed information for their side. They developed, tests, that both sides agreed to, the opponents and the advocates of capital punishment, the facts about the way it worked. And they found that when you gave them this information, they became opposed to it. So then the prediction is, if people knew more, they'd be opposed to it. They just don't know how arbitrary it can be and how it gets decided who is charged with, a capital offense and who gets charged, they're only asking for life imprisonment. It's the prosecutor, and, people didn't know things like that. So then, once you know, you can, in a sense, project what they would say if they were informed. So let's do that with the kidneys. There were a lot of things about kidneys I didn't know. Like, how long does someone spend on dialysis each week when they're, in advanced kidney disease and need a kidney soon? How many people think it's, less than 10 hours? I would have thought it was less than 10. I might even have said less than 5. But it turns out some people are going for dialysis 5-6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that has a big impact. For example, if you've got kids, you can't, spend time taking care of them. If you've got, a job, right, you can't hold down the job anymore if you can't do dialysis while you're at work. And so those kinds of facts make a difference. So now what we can do by adding information is project what people would say if they were informed. And informed about other things. I'll mention one that'll come up later, but it's relevant here as well. A lot of people say, well, remember one of those features that everybody agreed on was current state of health, okay? But somebody who has diabetes is not as healthy as somebody who doesn't have diabetes. But if you say, well, that means they shouldn't get a kidney, you're going to immediately disadvantage African Americans in the United States because more of them have diabetes. So if you tell people that, they didn't know that, now you tell them, now what are they going to say? So what we need to do is to do more advanced studies in order to measure how much this affects people, project out what they would say if they knew more about kidney dialysis and kidney transplant. Oop, wrong direction. What about bias? Well, that one's a tough one that people have brought up, before, and that diabetes is obviously was relevant to. But everybody knows that people's judgments affect bias. I mean, it's amazing how biased some people are. Luckily, it's only a minority. Partial solution is, notice, we asked people what should not be in it, and we just didn't have those in the features. So you didn't know in those scenarios what the person's race was or the gender. Part of the trick is you list the features that people think are morally relevant, and you leave off the ones they don't. But there still might be proxies, diabetes being one, home support being another. Much more likely to recover successfully from a kidney transplant if when you go home, somebody's going to be staying with you, watching after you, making sure you take your meds and so on. But wait a minute, poor families, some of these people are working 2-3 jobs. They can't make ends meet without that, and they don't have anybody to stay home with them. And so, that's going to disadvantage certain groups. Now, some people say, well, then what we ought to do is to leave out anything that is a proxy for the categories that we think should not matter. Impossible. You can't do it. There are too many of them. You'd have to take out almost everything. So, very frustrating until Crystal Yang comes along. She's at Harvard Law. And she says, let's leave those in, measure how much bias there is, right? You can just project how this is going to affect the African American population, the European American population, or the BAME people in the UK versus Caucasian, and whatever categories you find relevant, and then you measure the bias, and then you correct for it. If there's a greater probability by 0.07, then you lower them by 0.3 and raise them by 0.4 or whatever, 0.35. You shouldn't have picked an odd number. Okay. Now, this is still not going to be perfect. That's not the goal. I've given up on perfection. There's no ideal in this world. I'm old enough to know that. But what we want to do is be better than humans. And humans, there's a track record of disadvantaging African Americans with kidney allocations. And so the trick is to try to do better than that, okay? Inconsistency or instability. We're talking about inconsistency over time, as you'll see. I keep pushing the wrong button, sorry. So they're unstable and inconsistent if they give different answers to the same scenario on different days, okay? Now, in order to test this, if you give them exactly the same scenario, they're going to, they might remember it, and then they're going to give the answer just so they stay consistent. So what we did was we switched A and B, and we switched the orders of the features, right? And sometimes we even added a feature that was the same on both sides, so that couldn't favor one over the other. And so, but we got the same results using that method as the others. So just imagine we're changing the orders of the patients and the orders of the features, and it's the same scenario because you basically got the same patients with the same features, and which one do you give it to? So, for example, we had some, there. So we had 60 scenarios per day for 10 days over the course of 2 weeks. We've got a new study where we only did it for 1 week, but a lot more subjects. And there were 6 scenarios that were repeated every session. So in the first 30, these 6 appeared, and in the second 30, this 6 appeared. And 3 of them were uncontroversial. Here's an example. God, I keep pushing the, okay, this is the button I want to push. Yes. So, so that one was something that like 99% or over 95%, I think was our cutoff, agreed on who should get it. And that looks like it's going to be patient A is going to get it. And so on those scenarios, 99.2% were consistent. Notice that shows us something. That shows they're really paying attention to the features, right? They're not just doing randomly and getting confused or anything like that. It's like, they're really good at that. But in the controversial ones, in this one, you know, I think we had less than 70% agreed on who should get the kidney in the ones we labeled controversial. And there we had 85% consistency. Now, what does inconsistency tell you? Well, it tells you that they're not really sure. And they're not really committed. This is not as clear an implication of the values they really hold. Because if it were, they would stick with it. But if they're changing from day to day when there's no reason to change, at least in the scenario, because the scenario is the same, then it's a sign that their values are not as committed to that. Oh, I forgot I had one more here. I put this one in to show. Some people were like really like almost, they were very inconsistent. You know, this is out of 100 or so, I can't remember. And so the consistency was, you know, you had 4 people who were just random and 4 people who were almost random. And so, you know, so you have greater inconsistency in some people than others and greater inconsistency in some scenarios than others. And what we want to do is correct for that inconsistency by discounting the judgments to the extent that they're inconsistent on the grounds that it's supposed to be a sign that they're not really as committed to that weighting. So now, and I'll stop a second and get some questions. So we can correct for ignorance, told you how to do that. Correct for bias, told you how to do that. Correct for inconsistency, told you how to do that. So the idea is that the AI can predict, and we think should align with, what humans would say if they were informed and impartial and rational and stable. Okay? If you want to call it rational, you can, but stable. That's the kind of consistency we're talking about. Roderick Firth here. But there's a difference because Firth said the ideal observer, as if there's one, and he always agrees with himself, and yes, it's a he, of course, in Firth. And so we don't say anything like that. We say, you know, idealized, because nobody is fully informed or fully impartial or fully consistent, for that matter. So we want to improve and get the idealized judgment. We're not claiming that's a definition of right or wrong, so don't jump on me, philosophers. But it could be evidence that that the conclusion is right. And AI can then help us make these predictions about what people would do under those idealized circumstances. So that's a long response to the question about, yeah, but humans mess it up all the time. They do, and that's why we have to correct for it. Yeah?
So when you were talking about correcting for biases, are these, by measuring the indirect bias, is this only for explicitly defined groups, or?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be, and so we have to ask the society, like, which groups are you concerned about, you know, and which are not, and that's going to miss some. so it's not going to be perfect. But if we can get rid of the main biases, I'll be happy.
So it has like no way of, for example, accounting for like intersection.
No, you can account for intersectionality. You just have to define the groups the appropriate way. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I have more or less the same question. How can we make sure that our groups are represented? So we have different race, we have different males and females, age, and so on. In these groups, like doctors, patients, stakeholders.
Oh, you mean the survey? Yeah. You pay this company, and they find you those people. Seriously. We paid $20,000 for our last survey because we wanted them to go out and make sure that it was representative in a number of respects.
Okay, but how can you, it's probably unachievable for it to be totally representable. It's what, who decides who should be in these groups?
I think it's a social decision. We've decided, in the US at least, and I think in the UK, race is particularly bad. Gender is particularly bad, and you correct for those. And you are going to miss some. Because remember, we're not trying to be perfect, trying to be better. Let's get rid of the ones that are most kind of common and the ones that worry people most. Yes?
So you looked at a very, not necessarily simple, but the most basic form of consistency, which is given the decision again, would I make the same decision?
Absolutely,
In
yeah.
the same form.
The simplest, got to start, yeah.
But there would be also, I would say, a much more complex but also important form of consistency where I want to keep the ranking above patients the same. So I want to keep the order and the relationship between patients the same. Have you looked at incorporating this kind of consistency also into your models? Yes,
We have, and in our paper, which I can send you if you want, we discuss that. But it gets very technical, so I didn't want to do it here. Yeah?
What happens if two different AI models disagree on a judgment?
Then we try to figure out why and have to make a judgment call about, which one to trust. I mean, yeah. I don't know any other way to do it.
And would a patient have the right to appeal the decision?
Well, well, first of all, when you wake the doctor up at 3 o'clock in the morning, remember you got to do it right then. So they might not, have any chance to appeal the decision before it's already done. But they can question it afterwards, and we'll be able to. These are all interpretable models. We can say because of this feature and that feature and how much weight they put on them and how they interacted. That's why we gave it to him. And the patient can say, that's not fair. And then we'll say, tell us why. We'll listen to you. And if you convince us, we will incorporate it into the algorithm, and you'll be at the top of the list next time. I don't know what else we can do. Yeah? I'm trying to call him. I haven't called him on before. So.
Is there a reasonably neutral way of establishing what information you feed? Because you can easily imagine a situation where one think tank gives them this information about that, and then another think tank does that on death penalty, and then you almost manipulate your participants.
Yeah, if you gave different information, you could manipulate them. That's why it's important in the study to have gotten information that both sides agreed on. So you go, which 10 questions would you ask defenders of death penalty if you wanted to manipulate it in your direction? And then, which 10 questions would you ask opponents of death penalty if you wanted to? And now let's do both. Yeah. Yeah?
Is the valuing of consistency slightly misleading though? Because some people might be extremely consistent, but on some flawed basis, where someone says, well, if someone's been an offender, I would never allocate them a kidney. And so every single time they will answer your questions in the same way. But morally speaking, I might seriously disagree with their mindset. But those will be the people who are most consistent because they formed a very narrow view on a single issue. And these are difficult questions. Surely we want people to maybe differ about it because it's not that easy.
Yeah. that certainly is a real possibility, and we looked into it. In our data, there is some evidence that some people are doing that, but there's not much evidence that very many people are doing that. I mean, it might be in another sample, it's a restricted sample, but yeah.
So if I was to be the head of a hospital, I'm considering that resources are limited relative to demand. What would happen if we put into your algorithm that any extra allocation of an intervention like that would mean one intervention, let's say, for treating a child with cancer?
I'm sure. I mean, we're talking about somebody who needs a kidney transplant, and a kidney becomes available. What's the resource? You mean the cost of running the program?
No.
We'll give it to them for free.
No, so to have competitive risk assessment on, bringing the model in a more general context where an extra intervention in one department, medical department, may mean one less intervention in another department.
So I'm not sure what you mean by the intervention. Is the intervention the use of the AI, or is it the kidney transplant?
The kidney.
Yeah,
So if you were to take into the algorithm account for...
So the hospital administrator has to decide, like, how much money am I going to give to the kidney transplant center, and how much am I going to give to the cancer center? And then the kidney transplant center takes the money it's allocated and does the transplants that it can. But this is not going to solve that money allocation problem. But it's not going to make it any worse, because you're still going to do the same number of transplants, and they might even be more successful.
Do you feel there's a big risk of hackers trying to access these systems and affect decision making?
Yeah, they're always hackers. The good thing about this one, I'm worried about hackers in self-driving cars. Terrorists saying, drive this car into the pedestrians, that's where I'm worried. In this one, maybe somebody who's down the line would hack into the system, and and so you ought to protect against that. Yeah, but it's not going to be perfect. You do what you can. Yeah, was this a follow-up? Yeah.
Kind of. Will the weights of the model be public? So will
Yes.
Okay, so I can actually see how I could influence my variables to get it.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
You could commit a crime. In fact, or you could fake a crime for the person but you don't know which person you're competing with.
No, but
So
I could of course look at the characteristics that would make myself more likely.
But they're not the kind of characteristics that you can really change. Like, you can't make yourself younger.
No, but I could make myself more still, for example.
You could. Fine. I say that as somebody who needs to. Sorry. Yeah.
Would you, from an epistemological or ontological way, say that this is still morality, or have you basically transferred human morality into logic? Is this morality anymore? Because I don't feel like it is anymore.
So I don't think that our system is making a moral judgment. Okay. So to that extent, I agree with you. It's predicting which moral judgments humans would make. Okay. That's what it's doing. Yeah?
For the different stakeholder groups that might have more expertise in a particular area, so you mentioned, say, doctors or people who have influence working in families, how would you go about weighting those and balancing
We don't have an answer to that. I mean, that's a big problem. But yeah. To be honest, I don't have an answer to that. We're going to have to look at where they differ, and then we're going to ask why, and look at how good the reasons are. But that's all really vague, and it's going to be a real problem. But notice it's really hard to do it now. So yeah.
We have 15 minutes left, so up to you how you want to use this in your presentation.
Yeah, I've only got a couple more applications which you can get to or not get to. So I'm happy to do questions if people. Yeah.
Coming from computer science, you talk a lot about constitutional AI.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you're aware how your approach fits within this.
So when I've only read a few articles that talk about that, and I found them very confusing because I thought they meant different things in the different articles. So you tell me what you mean by it, and I'll tell you how it fits.
And to be honest, it is confusing even for us.
Ah, yeah. Okay, that makes me feel better.
But I think like given the articles that I have read, yours is a new perspective because usually what research does is they combine the answers of different people to try to teach AI, and what you are doing is to predict what individuals will do, and so I think that would be quite an old perspective also for institutional AI.
Yeah. So constitutional AI is more of a top-down.
Yes.
Yeah. And I gave my arguments against that. We're going to disagree. I don't know what principles to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Am I right that there are still elements of probability in the model? So
yes.
If you run the same program again and again over time, actually the results will be different. And if that's different, like how do you
Any set of data is going to get you to a set of models, but not a particular model. And so it's going to be a probabilistic thing, and you might end up with a different model if you reanalyze it. Yeah. But there are going to be limits to how much difference it's going to make. So actually, in the paper, we discuss that and look at kind of all the set of possible things and measure how different the different algorithms are going to be, the different models. But again, it gets so technical, I didn't want to bring it in here. Yeah.
You mentioned you had a hybrid account, but it seems like everything you talked about today was bottom up. I would have expected an ethicist or a moral expert or some sort of moral principle to the top-down direction, but we didn't have anything about that yet. Everything's been bottom up so far, is that right?
And so it's not all bottom up because it's constrained by what the features are. Remember, we don't have African American in there. We don't have, right? And so there are restrictions which actually makes the algorithms work better. Without those restrictions, it would be very difficult to make it work. Let me mention a couple of other applications because we are running low on time. I'll just, let's see. Good. So I've got 10 minutes left. Kidneys are just the start. Now we're working using similar techniques for dementia. The problem is that a patient might be diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, and they still are capable of understanding and so on. They might have a bad day or forget a few things, but you can remind them and then they remember. And so during that period, the idea is you gather data, build an AI predictor, and what you're predicting here is not their moral judgments about who ought to get a kidney, but there are predictions about, yes, in this medical crisis, if I have a heart attack, this is what I would want done. If I start having trouble breathing, this is what I would want done. If I stop eating, this is what I want, would you want the doctors to force feed you or not? Which is, by the way, happens quite often in late stage dementia. So, I should say, what happens now is that you're told when you're diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, it would probably be wise for you to go to talk to your lawyer and have a living will or an advance directive if you don't already have one. And you also need to name a surrogate who's going to make these decisions for you after you become incapable of making them for yourself. There are two problems with surrogates. One is that surrogates, in study after study, have gotten it right about 52 to 64% of the time, when 50-50 is random. We're talking a dichotomous decision. So if you just guessed at random without even reading, you'd get 50-50. And the surrogates are down pretty close to that. And the second one, which is related, and I might explain why, is that when people make life and death decisions for their loved ones, then again, in multiple studies, they suffer PTSD symptoms, not full-blown PTSD, but serious symptoms over 50% of the time, and in one study, over 80% of the time. So you want to make it easier on the surrogate and more accurate so the patient actually gets what they want. Then we say, let's build a patient preference predictor. So while they've got mild impairment, You ask them what matters to them, which is like asking them which features are morally relevant. Then you ask them, you create conflicts and ask them, what would you want if this happened? What would you want if this happened? Giving them the background and the situation they're in, none of which is included in a living will or advance directive. They go, would you want to be put on a ventilator? I mean, when I saw those questions, I went, I don't know, it like depends. Like, do I have to check the box, yes or no? That just seems crazy. But these are going to be very concrete conflicts. And then you build this patient preference predictor using the same general idea to predict their preferences. You test it against their actual preferences while they're still competent. You allow them to change a year later if they say, I've got a new view of the situation I'm in now. You compare it to their potential surrogates and to the doctors and so on. And then, there we go, repeat every year. And then you let the patient choose. Like, do you want to use this? And how do you want to use it? You could say, well, I still want my surrogate to decide, but I want them to, you could say, I don't want to have anything to do with it. You could say, I want to have my surrogate decide, but I want them to look at this predictor of what my preference would be. Okay? And you could say, I don't want to burden my surrogates. I want this machine to do it. Up to you. We're not telling you how you ought to use it. We're trying to give patients control over how these decisions are made. This is in process too. Up to the mid-80s in accuracy on this one. Military. Which target should you hit with a drone? Well, you've got commanders out there that hit targets. How much do you trust them as opposed to their commanders? So let's look at set up different scenarios. So here's one from Ronnie Arkin, where the drone is going to hit a terrorist group while they're in amongst an apartment building, a hospital, and a taxi stand, or it could wait until the van carrying the terrorists moves 3 miles east, and then it hits it, and fewer civilians will be killed. You ask military people, what would you do? And they say, you got to hit that terrorist when you can. Too bad for the civilians. But the AI system can say, look, we've got satellite data on the movements of this van. It almost always goes to the east. And over there, there's a lot fewer civilians. And it can do that in a millisecond. This is Ronnie Arkin's idea. And so maybe produce fewer civilian deaths. Very controversial. Criminal law. Who gets bail? Well, are you going to trust judges? Bail decisions in New York State, on average, are given 6 minutes to decide whether this person gets bail or not. So I'm not necessarily talking monetary bail, but just pretrial release, where they have to promise to come back for their trial date and not to commit a crime while they're out on bail. Okay? So those kinds of bail violations, the decision is supposed to be based on a prediction of how likely it is that this individual would do it. Well, again, we can use our techniques to have an AI predict that. And it's going to, I forget who said, but there's going to be probability bars on it. You're never going to be certain. So maybe you go with the AI when it's over 80% or over 90%. And less than that, maybe you call in the judge. And if the judge agrees with the AI, you go it. But if he disagrees, you go to a panel of judges. There are all kinds of procedures that you could do to use something like this, and that's it. The one we're not doing is probably the best known. You might have noticed I didn't talk a lot about autonomous cars because I find this like totally fakey. Okay, female doctor, how do you know she's a doctor? Oh, she's carrying this thing with a red cross on it. All doctors do that, right? And female executive, which one is the executive? Oh, the one with the briefcase. Of course, that makes her an executive, And so you're going like you're driving here and you've got a split second to make this decision and the AI is supposed to decide who's homeless. You know, it's like, what? One of my favorite websites is homeless or hipster. And you can't tell. And so this is not what we're doing. We are looking at these three extensions. And so I thought I would just mention them, that, you know, kidneys are only part of it. So if you want to read more, you can obviously do the rest of the book. Go and look at the rest of the book. But I want to see, do I have time? I don't know. Yeah, so I've got 4 minutes for one question. If people have other questions about any of those. Yeah?
As you solve the problem of accountability in these models, so I take your point that humans could also make errors, and it really matters that these models make few errors, but in the cases where sometimes an error has been made, who takes responsibility?
See, I didn't say that. I remember that chapter on the accident in Arizona, and they all could be. And our answer is, they're all responsible. It's not that none of them are. It's that they all are. Does that mean they each only have a little bit of the pie? No. Responsibility is not like a pie. You know, you're responsible in the sense that you have control over that, and the burden is on you to do what you can to stop it from happening again. Responsibility is different from blame. Blame is when you're like getting down and saying you're a bad person. We're not saying that, but we are saying you didn't do your best job. You have control. Do better next time. That's the sense in which we're holding people responsible. Yeah?
So Walter, I really like your model. I think you should implement it. But like my question is, what's next? How do you plan to move from your book to the actual book? What's next?
I mean, so for this one, I started a company this summer to build the predictor. For this one, I got a grant from DARPA to develop it. I can't tell you any more about it. Oh God, I hope that's not, no. I can say. But this is Arkin's plan, not ours. So I'm not telling you what ours is. And for this one, we're applying for a grant from National Endowment for the Humanities in the US, to start a center at Duke to work on this one. I mean, that's how you do it, and it'll take a long time. Yeah?
And with the dementia example, could you see a future where people give lasting power of attorney to AI if they're doing better in the survey?
I would. I mean, I must say, look, I sat there and I go, okay, so who would I make my surrogate? Ask yourself, who would you make your surrogate? I thought, okay. So I could make my wife my surrogate. She would just fall apart. This would be devastating to her. We've been married 47 years. She's not going to be able to handle that. I know her. And she agrees. So I can make my sister. Oh my God, no. My sister does not understand me. Like, it's been a problem for many years. And so I don't want my sister to do it, So what about my kids? Uh-oh, I got 2 kids. Which one? Then the other one's going to resent it. Oh, I'll make them both co-surrogates. What if they disagree? It's going to break them apart. Who's going to be my surrogate? And it's like, one of my golfing buddies. I don't know. I mean, it's just like, so I'm thinking, if they can show me that this is accurate, yeah, I'm going to go for it. But I think that's going to be the vast minority. We do find that of people over 60, we got 57% said they would use it in some way. But there are different ways to use it. Yeah.
I'm afraid we are. If it's like we want to go on forever because it's so fascinating, really, and it's very rare at 7 p.m. on a Friday afternoon we want to keep talking. But that tells a lot about how good this talk was. And I hope people will
It's only 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that's right.
But I hope people can stick around a bit, have a glass of wine, maybe continue a bit the conversation. So we would like you to do that. But before doing that, please join me in thanking Walter for a great very
Thank you. Thank you for having me.